In a nutshell, shifting baseline syndrome is the shift in ecological perception with each new generation across time. It's how a landscape goes from this to this without anyone kicking up too much of a fuss. But why is this concept important? And what implications has it for we humans who care about the natural world? If we want to understand shifting baseline syndrome, we have to understand ourselves as a species in the context of many other species. We alone are the species that have pushed cultural evolution right to its extreme. Of the two forms of evolution, genetic and cultural, we humans have taken cultural evolution to the next level. With this, we're extremely adaptable to change because through cultural evolution, we change the environment in ways that previously could not occur. If we were limited solely to genetic evolution, the changes to our environment would be slight, very minimal, and our genes would adapt themselves to those changes. However, because of the speed of cultural evolution, we're going to have to think about the changes we make to our surrounding environment and whether or not they're the right decisions. With this video, we will see how radical human-induced changes to European wilderness have largely flown under the radar and become normalized despite having changed both the appearance of and our cultural relationship with the natural world. Let's consider shifting baseline syndrome as it applies to the European continent. The first peoples to have walked on the European continent will have encountered a specific type of nature, a mosaic-like patchwork of heterogeneous habitat that was maintained by herbivorous ungulates who, through their browsing, grazing, wallowing, tree knocking and trampling, ensured there were many different types of habitat available to many different species all the time. These tasty herbivorous ungulates would have been hunted to local extinction by those people who first set foot on the European continent and replaced by the domesticates of those same people, the likes of cattle, sheep, goats and pigs. And over time, as humans began to obtain a greater proportion of their calories through agriculture, the surrounding landscape will have reflected this. We can think of agriculture as a sort of a cultural innovation. It's written nowhere in the genetics of humans that humans should till the earth, and yet we do, because this is evolutionarily advantageous for our species to do. For the longest time, humans interacted with nature in this way, their livestock grazing on the grasslands, their pigs being fattened on the mast, and firewood being collected from forested and shrubland regions. With the complete transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture, and the concurrent replacement of native herbivorous ungulates with domesticates, the surrounding ecology was subject to very different selective pressures. For example, the mast that fattened the pigs all came from tree species: the acorns, the wild apples, the wild pears, the wild cherries. Each came from a tree species, in this case the oak, the wild apple tree, the wild pear tree, and the wild cherry tree. Also, the wood used for warmth and cooking will have come from certain shrub species, such as the willow and the hazel. All of these species that were in some way or another useful to humans will have proliferated and spread either through the conscious, active propagation on behalf of humans of these species, or through the behavior of our domesticates. For example, carrying seeds on their fur coats and carrying seeds through their digestive tract and dropping them wherever their dung drops. So now, although the heterogeneous habitats, the mosaic-like patchwork of habitats will have been somewhat maintained, it will have changed slightly as a result of these different selective pressures. Then, in the 18th century, what will have first seemed like an innocuous change in preference for a certain type of wood, in this case, the change in preference from coppice wood to blocks of wood. This change in preference for a certain type of wood resulted in a massive change to European wilderness, or the European landscape. Coppice wood would have come in bundles, but for better household warmth and for the creation of charcoal, you need blocks of wood. Those blocks of wood were required in the 18th century because this was the Industrial Revolution time, and during that time, charcoal was in high demand. Those blocks of wood created better charcoal than did the coppice wood. With this seemingly innocuous change in preference for a certain type of wood, the landscape changed, and now instead of shrubland of hazel and willow trees or shrubs, these were replaced by beech plantations, beech tree plantations. Beech trees lended themselves to blocks of wood, creating blocks of wood better than did hazel shrubs or willow shrubs. When this replacement of hazel and willow shrubland with beech plantations first began, there was a clear distinction between wild regeneration and natural regeneration of tree species. Wild regeneration of tree species is how light-demanding tree species, the likes of the oak, wild apple, wild pear, and wild cherry we alluded to earlier on, could regenerate in the wild. This occurred in areas of the landscape known as groves. These groves were bounded by nurse species, and nurse species either have physical defences or chemical defences against herbivory. So take for example the bramble. This shrub has thorny spikes which act as physical defences against any herbivore who tries to chow down on it. And so within the protective boundaries of these nurse species, light-demanding tree species could grow outside of the forested regions in areas called groves. Natural regeneration, on the other hand, was a term used by foresters, and it referred to the regeneration of beech trees in those areas where a mature beech had just been cut down, and so light was reaching the inside of the forested region. And naturally enough, the beech seedlings that had fallen and begun to establish themselves into saplings could grow up in those regions. After a while though, this clear distinction between wild and natural regeneration was forgotten. Wild regeneration left the vocabulary and only natural regeneration was spoken about. And this is the interesting point when it comes to shifting baseline syndrome. If we humans forget about a certain alternative type of tree regeneration and only speak about one type, then that one type of tree regeneration becomes the only mechanism by which forests can regenerate. And then naturally enough, whatever comes along with that single definition, we understand as the only way a forest can form. At this point in history where the clear distinction between wild and natural regeneration was forgotten, people came to form a different picture of what a forest is in their minds. With natural regeneration, tree regeneration is moved from outside the forested areas in groves to inside the forested areas. And inside the forested areas there are no nurse species to protect young saplings from grazing, browsing ungulates. So herbivores now became excluded from forested regions by human intervention. Add to this the development of industrial agriculture and the large-scale planting of potato crops, and now the mast that previously fattened our pigs is no longer needed. On top of this, we bred grass species specifically for maximum yield in livestock. And so now there's no need for the grasslands of the mosaic-like patchwork of heterogeneous habitat. In the end, there is a complete spatial separation of herbivorous ungulates and forested areas, and this renders the European wilderness or landscape much less biodiverse than it was before, as the mosaic-like patchwork of heterogeneous habitat is no longer maintained by those ungulates. So to sum up the illustration of shifting baseline syndrome with this oversimplified overview of the history of the European continent, there was an initial shift in baseline from the nature that the first peoples to have first set foot on the European continent will have first encountered, which was maintained by the native herbivorous ungulates, to a nature slightly different as it was maintained by domesticates. Nonetheless, there will have still been a mosaic-like patchwork of heterogeneous habitat. Then, with the Industrial Revolution, there's a secondary shift in the baseline of what European nature is. And this nature involves a complete separation of herbivorous ungulates from forest regeneration. And this renders the European landscape much less biodiverse.